Hi everyone, let's start the video with a little bit of a controversial question. Who do you think would be more likely to support legislation that would make abortion more accessible? Is it men or is it women? Most people would say women because this would affect their bodies directly. This is just pure self-interest, right? But in a research article published in 1998, researchers asked the same question, and what they found was that there's really no difference between men and women's support or opposition for this policy. What about if you want to motivate people to donate blood? Would a $50 cash payment motivate them to do that? Again, most people predict that yes, given $50 would motivate donating blood. But the reality is that this cash payment had very little effect on the willingness to do so. What about if you propose to increase fees for students studying in a university? Would they be more likely to oppose it compared to students who just graduated and would not be impacted by the fee? This is a classic self-interest story, right? The reality is that the difference between current students who would pay the fee and graduating students who would not pay the fee was much smaller than people predict. These findings reveal a powerful truth, which is that we systematically overestimate the power of self-interest in motivating behavior. This bias can set us back in terms of how we interact with other people, how we manage relationships, and how we lead. In this video, we'll dive into the exaggerated assumptions about the power of self-interest. Let's start. So this finding is what psychologists call naive cynicism, and it's the tendency to assume that other people's opinions and behaviors are driven far more by personal gain than they actually are. It's actually alarmingly easy to think in this way. For example, when a coworker volunteers for a tough project, it's easy to think that they're just angling for a promotion. When somebody donates to a charity, it's very easy to think that it's probably just for a tax break or some social media likes. When a politician, especially somebody we disagree with, takes a principled stance, it's easy for us to think that they're doing it just for campaign contributions or to pander to their voters. But the science shows that we're usually wrong, sometimes dramatically so. People are influenced by self-interest, yes, but they're also influenced by other things like their principles, like fairness, like empathy, like loyalty to their group, and also by genuine care for others, way more than we give people credit for. So let's look at some eye-opening studies that were done in 1999, and they focused on how we judge responsibility in shared activities. In one study, the researchers asked married couples to rate who does more around the house. Some of the things that researchers asked about were positive things, like resolving conflicts or conserving energy by shutting off lights and so on, and spending time on appearance to please each other. Other things the researchers asked about were negative things like taking out your frustrations on the other person, causing arguments, or forgetting to do things around the house. These couples thought their spouse would be self-serving and assumed that their spouse would claim more credit for the positives but shift blame to them for the negatives. However, the results showed that spouses rated their own and each other's contributions pretty fairly. Each spouse rated their own positives about equal to their own negatives. In other words, the spouse were actually much less self-interested and self-serving than they assumed about each other. The researchers found the same pattern in team games, in debates, and in sports. Players expected their opponents or teammates to hog the credit for wins and blame others for losses. But this didn't happen nearly to the extent that participants thought. This is naive cynicism in action. We assume that others are biased by self-interest, but the reality is that others are far less driven by self-interest than we think. So why does this happen? In part, it's because we know a lot more about ourselves than we know about other people. So for example, we're aware of our own complex mix of motives. Sometimes we do things for selfish reasons, and sometimes we do things for principled reasons, and sometimes we do things for situational reasons. But for others, we usually don't have nearly as much access to their inner worlds. And so when we don't have that knowledge, it's easy for us to default to the simplest explanation of all, which is explaining behavior with self-interest. It's the simplest, most linear explanation for anything. Logically, it's the shortest distance from motive to behavior that there is. But whatever the cause, the result is that we underestimate how much altruism, fairness, duty, and genuine conviction actually drive human behavior. And so we end up overestimating the power of self-interest. Now, this bias isn't harmless. It's actually quite consequential. It can disrupt relationships, because constantly assuming that your partner, friend, or family member has hidden selfish motives just breeds resentment and it erodes trust. That leads you to be less likely to give them the benefit of the doubt. And that leads to more fights over who really did what and whether you really meant to help or were just doing it for yourself. Also, in politics and public debate, assuming that everybody is motivated by self-interest just fuels polarization. We end up dismissing opposing views as they're just protecting their wallet or power or identity, instead of engaging with the actual principles or ideas. It makes compromises feel impossible and turns every issue into a zero-sum game. In leadership, this is also huge. The job of the leader is to motivate the employees, and it's always a question of how best to do it. In another study from 1999, researchers found that managers often fall into the assumption that employees are motivated mostly by narrow self-interest, such as things like money or bonuses or external rewards. At the same time, managers assume that employees are less likely to be motivated by intrinsic drives like doing meaningful work, autonomy in their work, learning, and purpose. That's a systematic mistake. On their end, employees stated that they were actually more motivated by the intrinsic things like meaningful work, autonomy, and learning. Not only that, the managers themselves stated that they were motivated by intrinsic things. In other words, all the managers had to do was to project what motivates them onto their employees and they would have been accurate. But instead, they assumed the worst about the employees. This is a problem in terms of trying to incentivize other people, but relying on the wrong mental model. Instead, what we should focus on are motivations that go beyond narrow self-interest. Everybody wants to learn. Everybody wants to develop, have a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning in their work. If we focus on those things, we'd be more likely to successfully motivate our employees than if we just focus on narrow self-interest. Think about it. How many toxic workplaces are built on the assumption that people won't work hard unless you dangle money or threaten them? The good news is that awareness is the first step. Start questioning cynical assumptions. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily not true. After all, people are motivated by self-interest to some extent. But these assumptions should not be as far-reaching as you might think. Ask yourself, what principled or situational reason might there be for people for their behavior? Try to find direct evidence instead of jumping to assumptions about people's motives. Practice perspective taking by actually asking people about why they did what they did. Even if you suspect that people are not telling you the whole truth, you'll learn a lot more by asking them than by just assuming. In fact, it's often better to err on the side of assuming that what motivates people is a mix of self-interest and something else. That's usually actually the case. We don't usually do things that go against our self-interest very often, but we also don't do things just because of our self-interest. When you stop overestimating others' self-interest, magic happens. You get deeper relationships because you get more trust, fewer unnecessary conflicts, and stronger bonds. You also get better collaboration at work and in life because you cooperate more effectively and inspire others by giving them the benefit of the doubt. You also get less polarization in politics because you engage more with ideas instead of dismissing people as self-interested. And also, you get stronger leadership. You design better incentives that actually increase motivation as opposed to demoralize people. So in a world that often feels divided and cynical, recognizing this bias lets you see the surprising amount of mission-driven behavior and altruism in others. The power of self-interest is there, but we have to be careful not to exaggerate it. If we give people the benefit of the doubt, we'll motivate more principled, fair, and altruistic behavior out of them. So if this video made you think differently, like it, share it with somebody who needs to hear it, subscribe and hit the bell so you're notified when I drop additional videos about psychology like this. So let's give people the benefit of the doubt wherever we go. I'll see you in the next one.